So for those of you who were able to come to the first session this morning, you will have heard the significant breadth of discussion on the future policy direction in social care, and the potential implications for procurement and commissioning are vast. We could easily have made this a full day session and probably still not got through it all. But in the interest of time, we are focusing today on the principles of ethical commissioning and also the issues surrounding competition and collaboration. Joining me for the session today are a couple of speakers. I've got Susan Craig joining us from Scottish Government. She's the Procurement Policy Manager. Susan has over 10 years experience in procurement and more recently has been part of the team supporting the independent review of adult social care, so she's got some real experience in social care. Jennifer Dillon is with us. She's a Senior Policy Manager for Scottish Government and the Directorate of Mental Health and Social Care, and Jennifer's team in Scottish Government are looking at some of the reviews from some of the recommendations, from the Feely Review, and particularly is looking at the discussion around about ethical commissioning. And we've got Claire Thomas. Claire is the Policy Manager for COSLA in the Health and Social Care team, and Claire has significant experience working with local government in relation to commission services, and some of you may already have been engaging with her in relation to some of this work so far. In terms of the agenda for this morning, I'm going to hand over to Jennifer and Claire, who are going to give us a bit of background and context to the session. Susan is then going to take us through an interactive exercise, so she's going to ask a series of questions. If you agree that the answer is yes, we'd like you to put your hand up, and we're going to record people's opinions on this. That will then inform the areas that we focus on in the second half of the session, which is an interactive discussion session. So we're going to ask you to post some comments, questions, and we'll take on board your views and take those away. You can do that either by putting the comments or queries in the text box, and one of us will read them out, or you can put your virtual hand up if you want to ask a question at the end, and the conference team will enable you to speak. You just need to take your microphone off mute, and once you've done that, please, if you would put your hand back down and then remute again. So to test the interactive bit, I think I've got, on my next slide, some questions for you, just to give us a sense of who's all joined us today. So these are the questions, just before we do that, these are the questions that we're going to be asking in respect of the draft ethical commissioning principles. So we're going to be asking you, do you think it's clear? Do you think it should be included? And do you have any specific comments and concerns? And Jennifer will talk more about that in a moment. But if I just go on to the next slide. Yes, we're going to test the feature of putting your hands up. So we're keen to understand the audience today. So the first question is, do you work in procurement? And if the answer is yes, can you raise your hand for us? We're keen to know how many we've got in procurement versus commissioning, or indeed some other function. Okay, so looks like the final total is, still going. Okay. Procurement around 42, 43. Thank you very much. Can you put your hands back down, please? And then the next question is, do you work in do you regard yourself as a commissioning professional? Hands up if the answer is yes. Okay, looks like that was about 30 or so. So slightly less, but it's a nice mixed group of both procurement and commissioning, which is really quite helpful. The next question is to get a sense of the areas that you work in. So you may well have want to answer yes to both of these. So do you cover children's services primarily? Hands up for children's services, please, folks. So that was 22, and hands down, thanks. And then raise your hand if you focus on adult services, or indeed put your hand back up if you do both. Okay, this is the bigger group. Okay, quite most of us. All right, thank you, folks. So that's about 50 for adult services. So We've actually got a nice mix of people covering a range of areas, which is really helpful. And the putting your hand up works. That should hopefully be quite slick for us going forward. So thanks for that. I'm now going to hand you over to Jennifer, who's going to provide you with a bit of background and context to the rest of the session. So thanks, Jennifer. Over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for having me. So I just want to say that if you joined the speeches earlier today, my colleague Anna Kenniston will have taken you through some of the key elements of the independent review and some of our thinking on how this relates to ethical commissioning and how we move forward. As many of you will know, the independent review was announced on the 1st of September and it was published on the 3rd of February. And we've actually had obviously had our election between that period, so we're not quite that far on at the moment into what we're doing. The review focused on developing a deep understanding of the needs, rights and preferences for people who are using social care services. It examined how and in what circumstances they are currently being met and what needs to be significantly improved to ensure people's outcomes are consistently met across Scotland. There was wide stakeholder engagement, which in the first session most of the speakers talked about, and I just wanted to highlight that some of the engagement was also with local authority areas and integrated joint boards. Again, you'll know that the report had 53 recommendations and a number of these were directly related to commissioning and procurement. And having looked at the report, I'd say it's not just those that are in the commissioning and procurement section. Commissioning and procurement is a key thread throughout all of it. The report represents the beginning of the process for procurement, for improvement. So Scottish Government is, as I said, at the very beginning of the process of reviewing and understanding the recommendations and how these can be implemented. So far, we've carried out some deep dives internally into what we think this means for commissioning and procurement. And we've worked with procurement colleagues like my colleague Susan, who's on the call, to look at, okay, well, what is commissioning and procurement? Is there a joint definition that we can see the actual separation in? And what are the key principles of ethical commissioning? And we've shared those key thoughts with Scotland Excel and COSLA. I'm going to confess, I've worked in procurement in the public sector right up until January, and I'm very passionate about commissioning and procurement, and I really think that it can be a key enabler of change, which can really result in quality services that meet people's needs. So I really am right there with you and really hope that you'll engage with us because I think we have a real opportunity here. Again, as Anna said, but in case you weren't in the original session this morning, and again, I've said we're at the very early stages. The next steps for Scottish Government is we have a commitment to implement FEELI, but we don't know yet what implementation is going to look like. That we had a 100-day commitment as part of the new Scottish Government being formed, and it included a commitment to implement FEELI. We have formal consultation before the 24th of August for any primary legislation that's required. Now, to put primary legislation in place, this is likely to take 18 months. And there's going to be the opportunity for further engagement on implementation that may not be legislation. We want to engage with you as procurement professionals. This is one of many opportunities to engage. And I also want to highlight that there's a joint statement of intent with COSLA that on ethical commissioning and what the key principles are, which is what the session is about. And Claire Thomas from COSLA will talk about that more. Next slide, please. So what I've done here is put up ethical commissioning and procurement and the key principles that we've talked about. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about all these key principles, but what I want to say is what does this mean with some of our initial thoughts on what each of the key principles are? And we're really keen to hear from you about whether you agree with the principles and whether you think anything's missing. And I don't want to take too much time because this isn't about our thoughts, it's about your thoughts. So I'm not going to go into detail, but we might be able to put this slide back up for any discussion points. But really, it's person-centred first, human rights, there being full involvement of people with lived experience throughout the commissioning and procurement process, fair work practices, high quality care. And next slide, please, because my table was a little bit too big to put on one slide. Climate and circular economy. Now, we're aware that climate change wasn't covered that much in FEELI, but there is a Scottish Government commitment and we are committed to climate, so we've included that there. Financial transparency and commercial viability. Now, this is one that we've had a little bit more questions on what does this mean when we put it out. So I just want to say we're not We don't have a definition for this yet, but what we're thinking is open book costing, reinvestment, sustainability of the market, making sure that market data on costs are really considered in commissioning and procurement. And the other one is shared accountability, so making sure that the accountability sits in the right places, and that will require defined roles and responsibilities. So the next thing I want to say is we want you to engage with us. We want you to tell us what you think. I really want this to be a free and frank discussion. Open discussions are what help us understand the issues and opportunities. What are the challenges your roles face? What are your fears? Is there anything missing in what you would consider ethical commissioning? And of course, the big one for me is anything unclear? We all know what, to be frank, a nightmare it can be and a headache when there's a lack of clarity, and how easy it is for something that, for example, I have written and I know what I'm saying, how that might not read across when other people are reading it. So please tell us if something isn't clear. As I said, this is the first chance for you to consult and engage with us. There should be more as we move through feeling and implementation process. So please keep engaging with us. We want to hear from you. And I'll now pass over to Claire Thomas from COSLA.
Thanks, Jennifer, and morning, everybody. So if you joined the open session, you'll also be aware of the COSLA position in relation to the independent review of adult social care. There are some areas that are challenging, but broadly we support the outcome of the review. And to make progress on the areas that we are in agreement with, we published a joint statement of intent just before parliamentary recess. One of those commitments was in relation to ethical commissioning. The Feely report sets out that we should move to an approach that takes account of more than price, including things like fair work, terms and conditions, and trade union recognition. However, the report doesn't set out exactly what this means or how it should be done, and this is the piece of work that we're starting with Scottish Government and with you today. It's necessary to do this collaboratively across the system and rely on the expertise of people that work in commissioning and procurement. We've undertaken some initial kind of sense checking in relation to those high level principles. So some of you may have seen these already. That was with the Chief Officers of Health and Social Care Partnerships, and also through the Social Work Scotland Commissioning and Procurement Network. The very initial views were broadly supportive of the principles, although of course there were questions about what this actually means and how it would be implemented and what it means for commissioning and procurement. So this is really, as Jennifer set out, an opportunity to continue that engagement, and it really will be an ongoing process. For those of you who work in children's services, you'll be aware that there's very similar sort of recommendations and discussions in relation to commissioning and procurement and some of the areas set out in the promise. Whilst all of us today work in adult social care, we're really keen to link up with colleagues in other policy areas, and we're certainly doing that from a kind of COSLA and Scottish Government perspective to ensure that our thinking and the work that we're doing is really joined up. Susan's going to take you through the session.
Thank you, Claire. So yes, very brief introduction from myself, but let's get on to having a conversation about this. Susan Craig, working in the Scottish Government Procurement Policy team. I've been involved in procurement policy and social care policy for numerous years, and was lucky enough to be part of the team supporting the independent review, which was a very exciting, rapid process, and which I'm sure you agree has resulted in some radical recommendations. So, ethical commissioning and procurement. Could I ask that we move on to the next slide, please? Jen took us through the various principles. There are 8. We've looked to try and group them together today to get your views. So first of all, these 3 areas here, person-centred care first, a human rights approach, full involvement of people with lived experience, are all about the person. We think these are fundamental and really important parts of the principles. So could we use the raise hand function and let's answer each of these questions in turn. We're going to keep a tally of your responses so we get your input, and then that will help us focus the discussion we can have in this session this morning. So first of all, is it clear what we mean by these 3 areas? If you could raise your hand if you answer yes. Okay, so quite a positive response to this already. Thank you. If you could take your hand down, and then we'll ask, should it be included? Should these 3 things, all about the person, be included in the principles of ethical commissioning and procurement? Excellent. Oh, very high response to it being included. Appreciate that. Thank you. If you could lower your hand. Do you have any concerns or comments about what these three things are, how we implement them, how we do actually affect them in adult social care services going forward? Raise your hand if yes. Oh, not too many concerns being raised in this area. That's really interesting. Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to be rapid here and move on to the next slide, please, if you could lower your hand. So next area of the principles is around fair work practices. It's been key, it's been government policy for a while, so this is where we're trying to address practices which are above law and recognise the workers in the sector. Again, please raise your hand if you think it's clear. Oh wow. Maybe we are starting to understand what fair work means and in this sector. That's excellent, thank you. If you lower your hand, do you agree it should be included? Oh wow, high responses to this too. Hope that recognises we all agree the workforce are key to the delivery of these services. So again, if you lower your hand and go to the third part, do you have any comments or concerns about this issue? If you raise your hand, if you answer yes. Not too many concerns about that then in comparison. Thank you. If we could move on to the next slide. Now we want to think about high quality care, which we think is part of the principles of ethical commissioning procurement. Raise your hand yes if you think it is clear. Okay, relatively high response there too. Should it be included? Lower your hand and raise yes if you think it should be included. Overwhelmingly supporting it. Lower your hand. And do you have any comments or concerns about how do we deliver high quality care? Thank you very much. Okay, not too many concerns about that. Something we probably do as a day job, eh? Next slide, please. So climate and circular economy, relevant in everything we do in public services and in support services for adult social care and children's, of course. Raise your hand if you think this is clear. Okay, thank you. Not maybe so many hands for this one about it being clear. Lower your hand if you raise it, please, if you think it should be included as a principle of ethical commissioning and procurement. Great, and last one. Lower your hand, please, and do you have any comments or concerns about how we do include this as a principle? Thank you all for inputting. It's really valuable to get your feedback. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you for that. If you lower your hand, and next slide, thank you. Again, we've grouped two together, the last two we want to ask about, which are related to do with responsibility and accountability. So financial transparency and commercial viability of the market and the services that we commission and procure, and shared accountability, so that's shared accountability with the providers. Raise your hand, please, if this is clear. Oh, yep. Oh. Counting up, counting up. Okay, that's helpful, thank you. Lower your hand, and do you agree these should be included? Excellent. Great support there. Thank you. Lower your hand. Any comments or concerns about these areas as being part of the principles? Helpful. Thank you. Not too much there. Okay, let's move on. We've only got 2 more slides and then we're going to be able to come back and have a discussion about what's been raised as key areas. Do you think there are any other principles that are included? Just please raise your hand if yes. And then in the discussion, if there are, we can pick these up. So, one suggestion there from Stuart. Oh, others are popping in. It's quite hard to think of what's not there, isn't it, rather than think about what's included. Thank you. I think if you lower your hand, we can move on to the last slide we'd like to get your view on. And this is this issue about competition. Do we agree that competition and collaboration are mutually exclusive? Raise your hand if yes. Not very many views there. Paul, thank you. And then finally, should we have competition in social care procurement? Raise your hand if yes. Certainly a key point that was raised in the recommendations, and you'll have heard Annie's view on this, that competition does not support what we're trying to deliver in social care services. So not unanimous there, which is interesting from this audience. But some people agree that yes, we should be having competition in social care procurement. Okay, Claire, can I hand over to you to reflect on what we've heard from others?
Absolutely, thank you, Susan. So I think a couple of areas, there seem to be quite broad support for person-centred human rights, full involvement of people, fair work and high quality. But some of the areas that it might be worth coming back to are in relation to the climate and circular economy. And there's some comments in the chat box around about that as well. And also any other principles. I think it would be worth coming back to that question just to get people's views. So in relation to climate and circular economy, Jennifer, do you want to give a quick overview of that first slide that broke down those areas?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute there. Okay, so as I said, this is just some key thoughts that we had from an initial discussion that I basically put on post-it notes. But for us, climate and circular economy, I think what we're really thinking here is that we don't want any sort of sustainability requirements or testing of sustainability and ensuring that we are supporting the climate to be a tick box. We don't want social care to be kind of left behind and it to be thought as something that is not appropriate for social care or something that is kind of secondary. We think that what should be happening with any sort of commissioning and procurement in any sector, including adult social care, is that it should be one of the core elements that's thought about, and how do we support the Scottish Government commitments to prevent climate change? How do we support, and I know local governments have commitments at the moment as well. Susan, you might have something more that you want to add on that.
Yeah, happy to add to that. I think when it comes to procurement of any services, climate is proving to be key and a clear expectation in any aspect of our consideration. So whether that be about the travelling between visits and services that would happen in a care environment or the buildings that we use or any other part of the service type, it's going to be key and we need to be doing our level best to address it even in these services.
As this is an interactive session, I am very open to any of your thoughts on this or anything that you think is overlooked or anything you think that we're currently doing, any barriers, that type of thing. Obviously, you can raise your hand or you can put some comments in the chat box on this. As I say, it's an interactive session. We don't have all the answers, and we just know that we want to have commissioning and procurement that supports the Scottish Government's core objectives on the climate.
So there's quite a few questions and comments in the chat box, but not about the circular economy part. So if anyone wants to quickly jump in and give us their view on their comments or anything in relation to that before we move on, and we'll maybe pick up some questions from the chat box. Okay, there's just some comments there about things that might be might be important.
I know from, sorry, Jennifer. No, I was going to say, I know from our initial discussions I had with procurement colleagues, there was that question of we already have the sustainable procurement duty, and we're already doing, you know, in procurement terms, we know the whole people, planet, profit, especially if you've gone through the pain of SIPs, it'll have been drained and it'll have been bashed into you. So it's one of these things where there might be a bit of an overlap with this. And for us, what we're trying to make sure is that ethical commissioning and procurement doesn't forget about the sustainability, doesn't forget about the planet.
Jennifer, sorry, there are a couple of hands that are up. Jonathan Livingston and Bev Walker.
Okay, Bev, can we go to Jonathan if we could?
Oh, they've just gone back down. I think they might be
I've
legacy.
I've just left my hand up. Apologies.
Okay, no worries. Bev, did you have something you wanted to add specific to the the climate change and circular economy point, or another question? Perhaps also a legacy hand.
Yeah, Bev's hand's gone back down as well.
Okay, fair enough. Can I suggest we maybe have a bit of a chat about some of the things that are coming through on the chat box? So in particular, there's some points around about the market and capacity, which I think are quite interesting. And Sean, I think, has also raised an interesting point when we asked the question about whether we should or shouldn't have competition. Sean's point is, depends what is meant by competition. So I suspect that the point there is that there are some elements of it which are okay and some which aren't. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to put their hand up and potentially elaborate on some of that, give us some feedback on their thoughts. Karen Quinn, if you would come in, please. Karen, I think you may be on mute, or the team might need to take you off mute if not. Okay, we'll maybe come back to Karen then. She's stuck on mute.
Got it.
Oh, success.
Technology is great, but it's working. Yeah, I just want to pick up about, yes, sustainability is ingrained, and I did my SIPs as well, but the whole comment that it's getting the committees involved with local authorities that obviously are the ones who pass the contracts and the tenders at the end of the day. It's getting the whole system to join in with you. And I know we'll get the advertisements on the television now with Scottish Government with the net zero and everything carbon zero. And I've done the Way Scotland recently with the climate change emergency training with them. So I am very well up and very well aware of it, but it's getting everybody on board and on the same page that I don't know how are we going to get the committee members to jump on board, that they're going to pass contracts and tenders that are going to come up in front of them. That would be my only concern. And how can we get them involved?
Okay, thanks for that point, Karen. I think there's some other, in the terms of the chat box, there's some other people raising potential concerns around about resistance from providers in this area and getting the balance right in terms of the requirement to look at sustainability versus other considerations. So I think we've probably got, that's an area where potentially I think there might be a bit more work to be done in terms of going away and looking at that and how that might work in practice.
Jennifer, can I come in for a second? I just wanted to go back on Karen's point and just say, if that's a challenge and a barrier, does anybody on this call have any ideas of how we can, get that back, how we can get people to support this, and how we can get committees to support this? Are there any ideas on this call? You've worked with stakeholders, you've worked in these areas, you're on the ground. Is there anything you've done that's worked? Is there anything you think the Scottish Government can do? Always a nightmare when you're met with deathly silence. Maybe that's something that we need to take away. But if anybody has any ideas or anything that has worked, we have talked about in the session the need to be collaborative and cross-functioning and all work together. So, sharing of lessons learned, things like that, we're open.
On the climate thing, I noticed there's really quite a lot of very helpful comments with regards to which parts of the care service can contribute to this. So I would hope that's enough to persuade those who are going to make decisions about how we can have the benefit for the people, as well as obviously the climate. But whether it be in food, whether it be in air conditioning, whether it be, because it's all about the quality of the service. So great ideas, guys. Thank you.
And there's ideas still coming through in the chat box, which is helpful. So we can go away and make a note of all of this and provide some feedback to everybody who's participated in relation to this. I wondered if it might be helpful to pose a question to those who thought that the principles as they were shown might not quite cover everything. So I think we had maybe 4 or 5 folk who suggested there might be something missing or some area that we should give further consideration to. So if anyone was willing to put their hand up and say give us some suggestions on that, I think that would be most helpful. Stuart. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Stuart Calderwood. I'm Community Benefits Sustainability Manager at City Shire Highland Councils. So I'm not directly relating to care commissioning, but just sort of, I put it in the chat about maybe something around using community benefits, developing the workforce of tomorrow, maybe making use of the care related apprenticeships, that there's maybe not enough of that, and developing people that are in the profession to progress. So it's kind of linked to fair work practices, but it does sit separately, I think. So maybe there should be, I think developing the workforce of tomorrow might be quite a good banner for it.
Yeah, Stuart, a really good point, and something key that came out in the review, that unless we invest and respect and value the workforce and plan for the future, the services are going to be really going to struggle. So completely agree. And yeah, it does fit with the fair work, but it's a particular angle, isn't it? I agree completely. Good points.
We're getting agreement in the chat box as well as some nodding. So I think that's an interesting one for us to go away and explore. Does anyone want to offer any other suggestions as to areas that that haven't been that might well be worth thinking about adding in terms of the draft principles? Okay, well, I think that's very positive. I think the feedback we seem to be getting is that the draft list as it stands is fairly comprehensive, and there might be some further consideration in relation to bits in respect to the workforce. But that sounds really quite good. Can I pose another question to the group then? So most people agreed quite clearly that all of the principles should be included, but some of them, I think we got a less of a positive response than others. I'm wondering if anybody wants to suggest whether any of the principles as they are on the list should be considered for not being included or for change in some way. Or it might be we are generally agreeing that the list is looking fairly good. Neil's just put an interesting point there in respect of the workforce stuff. Community benefits not by care providers are generally not received well, and I think that's an experience that I'll certainly echo. So yeah, that's an interesting point and one that we will definitely have to find a way around. We don't have much time left, folks. So really, this is, I guess, a call for last few questions. If anybody wants to put their hand up and pose something to the group that we've got here, or give us any other comments, questions, feedback.
Or any barriers that you're facing, that would be good to know as well.
Christine has her hand up. Christine, if you want to jump in, thanks. Christine, sorry, we can't quite hear you. Could you speak up a wee bit?
Is that better?
That's you, got you.
So it kind of just jumps in with what Jennifer was saying about barriers. So I work in North Lanarkshire Council in the quality assurance section. A lot of questions we get in terms of the councillors' inquiries are around fair work practices and the Scottish living wage, and do providers actually support that? And we very much promote that, and we very much push for it, but we have no legislation around it to enforce it. So that is a major barrier for the process, and that would be across Scotland. Yeah. So that was just to raise that point, because I know that, you know, we very much recently went through a new procurement process where we have a flexible framework. So this is a kind of new way of looking at it. And what that's brought forward is a number of councillors' inquiries. So we're only into June. The new process came in at start April. So I can only see that becoming more and more. And we don't have any kind of power to enforce anything.
Could I maybe come in there? There's a session on fair work later in the day that hopefully some of you will be joining, but it absolutely doesn't have the answers about some of these issues that you've raised. There'll be a set of recommendations coming out, and the next really big focus bit of work that we need to look at is the sort of implementation phase of this, because the points that you've raised are absolutely valid. I think the discussions that we've had with providers through the working group would say that there's a real appetite to do this. They need to have the levers and the funding to enable them to do it. But you're absolutely right. I think the lessons that we've learned through the sort of implementation of the living wage need to be really fully considered here, because it can't be mandated and there's no legislation for it. So really kind of pertinent issues that you're raising, and something we was certainly kind of interested to pick up with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any final questions, folks? We are just about out of time, but we did start a little bit late, so we can probably roll on for another 5 minutes if anyone wants to have another question. There's some interesting responses in the chat box in relation to barriers and things, which I think will be helpful to go away and collate and have a think about. Okay, I think we're probably covered then everything that we need to, unless anyone wants to, Claire or Jennifer or Susan, anything you want to add before we sort of draw the session to a close? Well, thank you all very much for your input today and for your comments in the chat box, and for those of you who posed questions to the group or gave us some feedback. We will collate everything that's been said today and take that away. One of the comments that's in the chat box I think is probably quite good in terms of rounding up what I think we're hearing is that so Mary says the list is robust and comments possibly lie around the implementation and the shift from now to the future. I think that's a pretty good summary of what we're hearing. I think we're generally on the right track, but the question then lies in the sort of more nuanced aspects of implementation and how we do some of this in practice, which is clearly the next stages. So I think we'll bring everything to a close there, folks. Thank you very much for your time and for your input.